So what's your takeaway from last week's headlines in the media? That the Chinese People's Liberation Army has intruded deep into Indian territory in Ladakh and that the Indian Army is almost being beaten by the Chinese troops. Is that so? Well, that's not the truth. And on Simply Nitin this week, I'm going to tell you how the Indian military is no pushover when it comes to deployment all along the Himalayan frontier that faces Tibet, which is under occupation by China. I'm Nitin Gokhale. So let me take you through the map from east to west, starting from Arunachal Pradesh, going through Sikkim via Uttarakhand and then Ladakh in the west. This border with China runs almost 4,000 kilometers. It's undemarcated and contested between India and China. Now, the border has various names. In the east, it's called the McMahon Line, which was delineated or demarcated in 1914 when the British were still ruling India and Tibet was a separate country. Now, elsewhere it is called Line of Actual Control because India and China have still not agreed to the actual demarcation of the boundary. In some portions, both in Ladakh and Sikkim, the line is demarcated and settled. Therefore, it's called the international boundary. But let me not get into too many details there. Let me take you through the military deployment that India has done over the years. Gone are the days of 1962 when the Indian Army was overrun by rampaging Chinese in the Kameng sector, which is near Tawang or part of the Tawang area in Arunachal Pradesh, which was then called the Northeast Frontier Agency or NEFA. Now, when the Chinese came through the Bumla Pass and came down right up to the Bomdila and Bhalukpung area, almost touching Tejpur in the plains of Assam, the Indian Army of that vintage was not prepared, not acclimatized, not equipped, and did not have proper leadership when it took on the rampaging Chinese in 1962. The result? A military rout in a month's time when Indian Army was defeated in Kameng and parts of Ladakh where the action took place in the period between 20th October and 20th November 1962. But that was then. That's history. Today, almost 58 years later, the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force are well poised, well deployed and are in strength all along this boundary with China. So let's start of giving you the details or at least the publicly available details of Indian Army and Air Force deployments along the line of actual control and of course the McMahon line in Arunachal Pradesh. So let's start with Arunachal Pradesh, spread over 86,000 square kilometers. It is bordering parts of Tibet. Also, Tawang has the second oldest or the second most important Buddhist monastery. Now, in Arunachal Pradesh or the Arunachal Pradesh border is looked after by two army corps. One is based in Dimapur, which is the 3 corps, and the other is in Tejpur, which is 4 corps. Each of these corps have 3 mountain divisions under them to look after the Arunachal China boundary or Arunachal Tibet boundary. In Arunachal or near Arunachal in Tejpur, which is also the headquarters of the 4 corps, there is a Sukhoi air base or air base which has Sukhoi planes, the heavy fighters of the combat fighters of the Indian Air Force. Now that's Arunachal Pradesh for you. Come to Sikkim, which is governed or which is protected by the 33 Corps based in Sukna near Siliguri. Even this corps has 3 different mountain divisions looking after the boundary in Sikkim. Now, parts of the Sikkim boundary or most of the Sikkim boundary is a well settled international boundary, and yet remember the Chinese are creating mischief there either in Dolam, which is also popularly known as Doklam, as they did in 2017, or what they did in Nakula in May earlier this month. But there is another pass there called Nathula, where in 1967, barely 5 years after the 62 rout, the Indian Army gave a bloody nose to the Chinese in a fight at the Nathula Pass in 1967. Since 2014, there is a big change in India's outlook towards the land boundary. All these formations that I am speaking about are essentially defensive in nature, to stop attacks by the Chinese in case they start coming in like they did in 1962, which is now not possible, given the quantum of troops and the deployment that has taken place all along Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim, and I am going to speak about Ladakh a little later. But what happened in 2014, this was a decision after the 2013 standoff in DBO Depsang Plains, which I spoke about in the last episode of Simply Nitin. The Indian government decided to raise a mountain strike corps. For the first time, an offensive formation was sanctioned by the government, and under that mountain strike corps, which is right now headquartered at Panagarh in West Bengal, but has its elements, 2 mountain divisions, separate independent brigade, spread all along the China boundary. Their locations are somewhat kept secret because this is called a swing element in the deployment against China, which means the 17 Mountain Strike Corps has a role in Ladakh, in Arunachal Pradesh and in Sikkim as and when required, on the basis of the deployment on the other side, or a kind of development that might take place between Indian and Chinese armies during a hot war of a consequence, of some big consequence. So 17 Mountain Strike Corps is India's offensive weapon. It is not yet fully formed. It is in the process of being raised and formed and equipped. But we'll come to what its role is, further role is a little later. Move towards Uttarakhand, which is the least of the contentious or controversial boundaries, parts of the boundary between India and China. And yet, in the central sector or the middle sector, India has the 6th Mountain Division, which is also the Army Headquarter Reserve. It has a dual role. It can go to east if necessary, or it can go to west if required. So let's come to Ladakh now. It used to be the most neglected of the areas under the Indian military because of its tough terrain, inaccessibility and the tough mountains that one has to climb to get to Ladakh, either from Himachal Pradesh or from the Kashmir Valley. Until 1999, when the Kargil war happened with Pakistan, the 15 Corps based in Srinagar or headquartered in Srinagar used to look after the Ladakh area or the eastern Ladakh area bordering China. Now that has changed. Over the past 20 years, the 14 Corps has been raised in Leh. It is headquartered in Leh. Now it looks after the protection of the boundary with China. The entire eastern Ladakh stretch, starting from the Karakoram Pass, DBO, and coming right down to Chumur and Demchok, is looked after by the 14 Corps, which has 3 division, the 3rd division or 3 division based in Karu to look after primarily the China border. And remember, since 2015-16, the Indian Army has now pumped in 1 independent infantry brigade for DBO, which I had pointed out even in the last episode, and an independent armor brigade. For the first time after the 1962 war, the tanks have been brought into Ladakh in case there is a requirement in the plains of Demchok and Karu and Kyari, which is a little south of Leh when one looks at the map. So now India has substantial troop strength in Ladakh. Apart from 3 Div, there is the independent brigade in DBO, there is a independent armored brigade in Ladakh, near Leh, and there is the independent brigade which is in Siachen, which has nothing to do with the China border at the moment at least. So substantial troop strength in Ladakh. Let's look at the Air Force element across the border. So over the past 10 years, 6 advanced landing grounds called ALGs have come up in the farthest areas of Arunachal Pradesh which are otherwise inaccessible by roads. Even in Ladakh, the DBO airstrip, the Daulat Beg Oldie airstrip, which is 8 kilometers south of the Karakoram Pass, has been activated, and now it can take a landing of the C-130J Hercules medium lift aircraft. Although it requires a lot of maintenance, the fact is that India has the ability now to insert troops into DBO, airlift them from Leh or Chandigarh and then put them there because of the airstrip which has been activated. There is a plan to have an air base at a place called Neoma in Ladakh, which will give the air capability a new boost. And of course, let's not forget that over the past 6 years, the road construction and the infrastructure building, shelters, bridges, tunnels, and of course, long roads going right up to the line of actual control have come up across the Himalayan frontier, starting from Arunachal Pradesh, coming to Sikkim, Uttarakhand and Ladakh. In fact, one of the triggers for this current standoff at the Galwan Valley or the Galwan River Valley is the Darbuk-Shiok DBO road, the 255 kilometer road which was completed last year and has given India the ability to ply their vehicles and supplies round the year in that area, which is what bothering the Chinese, because they had built their infrastructure over the past 15 years at a very rapid pace in their area of operations, but now India is catching up, and therefore patrols from both sides are matching each other or coming across each other, facing each other more frequently than before. And the ability of Indian Army and the Air Force to do surveillance and reconnaissance in those areas of Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Uttarakhand and Ladakh has also gone up tremendously over the past 15 years. There is a landmark year one can think of. In 2008, the Indian government decided to overturn its decades-long policy of not building roads going right up to the line of actual control, because the thought process in those years, in the shadow of the 1962 military defeat, was that if we build roads and infrastructure, maybe the rampaging Chinese who come in again will be able to use it and then come rapidly into the plains of Assam, or use them to come to Nubra Valley or come to Leh, which is the capital of Ladakh. But that mindset has changed. Over the past 10-12 years, India has beefed up not just troops deployment, the equipping of the Mountain Strike Corps, the equipping of the mountain divisions that are there, and therefore, as I mentioned, on every front, India has got a muscular presence all along the Chinese frontier. It's no longer a pushover like it was in 1962. Of course, it was disproven in the 1967 skirmish at Nathula, but today, the Indian deployment along the Chinese frontier is almost evenly matched with the Chinese. If you look at the Chinese deployment in Tibet, permanent deployment or permanent stationing of their troops, even the Chinese have about 12 to 14 divisions stationed in Tibet, like India has now across this 4,000 kilometer frontier. So remember, I started off by saying, do you think Indian military is pushover? The emphatic answer is no. It is not a pushover. In fact, if push comes to shove, India can actually give a bloody nose to the Chinese when the balloon goes up, if it goes up. So don't worry, the standoff is one of those annual skirmishes that happen. Of course, this is qualitatively a little different because the Chinese have brought in little more numbers than they normally do, but so has India. Remember, at the Galwan Valley, where people are speaking about 5,000, 10,000 troops of the Chinese having come across, India already has a presence of the brigade in DBO, and now it has been reinforced by more troops that have been brought in, well acclimatized troops. One last point I want to mention. The Chinese frontier is tougher than the Pakistani frontier because in the Chinese frontier and along the Himalayas, the troops have to be well acclimatized. They have to undergo a 3-stage acclimatization. They have to spend 7 days at 9,000 feet, another 7 days at about 11,000 feet, and finally another 7 days at about 14,000 feet to be fit enough to get deployed in those high altitude areas. Remember, Ladakh is a high altitude desert and oxygen is in short supply. Shortness of breath is common, and of course several other diseases that come in the realm of high altitude deployment. But that is history. Indian Army and the Indian Air Force is well poised, well strung all along the Himalayan frontier and very well equipped to take on any Chinese misadventure. I wanted to tell you all this because this is something that viewers who watch Simply Nitin must know. India is no pushover when it comes to military deployment, matching the Chinese in Tibet. For this episode, that's all I have to say, but do keep liking us, following us on our social media handles, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and of course our YouTube channel, and do write back and ask me to do different episodes on different subjects. For the moment, it's goodbye.